Hello, everyone. This is Brandon, and welcome to a special podcast episode of Bran'sTech. How are you all? So, this is my very first video version that I'm having for a podcast. And so, with this, I am going to have a shortened version of the podcast here on YouTube, and then the full version will be on my traditional podcast stations, anywhere that you can find podcasts. But without further ado, this episode of Bran'sTech will begin in just one moment, so please stay tuned. All right, everyone, welcome to this episode of Bran'sTech. How are you all? I hope that everyone's been doing well. So today, as you can see, I have my guest for today, Carl. Welcome. I'm so glad to have you once again.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm really excited to see if you're watching this, well, if you're listening to this on the Bran'sTech podcast, this is actually where we're doing this in video, so we can actually see each other. It's a different experience. Hopefully it'll go well.
Yeah, I'm really hoping that this goes well as well. So today's topic is actually about the modern smartphone race. And so for those of you who have not heard, LG recently announced that they are leaving the smartphone race. There wasn't much else to the announcement, more so that they were focusing on other stuff such as their enterprise and their new consumer products that for them, they didn't really see a future in the smartphone market. And so their last day as a smartphone manufacturer will be July 31st of this year, I believe. To, of course, fulfill current contracts that they already have that they are obligated to do. But besides that, this is a rather, I guess, sad and I guess, I don't know what else would be the term, but a very bittersweet day for the smartphone market.
Yeah, it's interesting because, I mean, the whole thing with Android is that anybody can really do it, right? And LG definitely brought their own spin on things, which is really interesting to see. And they were easier and less expensive to buy than like a Samsung or a bigger Google phone necessarily. So it's sad to see them go, but I'm curious to see what their next projects are going to be.
Yeah, definitely. And for me, for those of you who don't know, I have actually used LG products for a while, like on and off. And so one of my first tablets that I had was the LG G Pad, for the full name, LG G Pad 7.0 LTEA, for that super long name. But I had really actually enjoyed my experience with that tablet. It wasn't something that I went out and purchased, for full disclosure. It actually came with my Samsung phone that I had, because Verizon had a deal at that time. And so, but I had really come in and very excited for the product. It was a really nice tablet. I went through two of them, no fault of LG. That was my bad. But it was overall a really good device. I really enjoyed it, and it was enough where, for my next phone cycle, I actually switched to LG phones for a little while, for about maybe a year and a half or so. And the device I had was the LG G6, and so, for those of you who don't know, because a lot of people aren't quite familiar with that phone, it actually came when a lot of smartphone manufacturers were switching to having a all-screen device, where instead of all of the physical buttons, instead you have a lot of more on-screen buttons and more of that experience where you have a 16 to 9 ratio, 2 to 1.
Yeah, I know, me personally, I haven't had as big of a influence, I guess, or experience with LG phones, but I do have one that is, I don't exactly remember what it was. I was just trying to look up and see if I could find it. Couldn't find it. It was the coolest LG phone I'd ever had. I got it a couple of years ago, and instead of like a regular Samsung phone that I'm used to now, that just seems kind of, you can't really see it much, but this is a Galaxy S10e. Compared to kind of their really simple, just copy and paste style from model to model, it was really interesting because it was intentionally made to be thinner in terms of, I guess, width. It was a lot thinner, and it was also taller, which is really interesting, but it still retained the same size, and it was actually a lot easier to handle than one of these new smartphones. But in terms of camera, I have to agree, their cameras have been pretty good. I really love that phone. But other than that, I think it's a really interesting move by them.
A lot of times, if we're thinking of smartphone, as much as I'd hate to say it, and there's so many amazing companies out there, whether they run Android or, unfortunate rest in peace to BlackBerry 10 and Windows, all of the Windows Phone, Windows 10 mobile iterations, but there's so many other like smaller operating system out there. But even still, there's over, I believe, 14. It's been a while since I've checked the number, but I at least know as of about 3 or 4 years ago, it was about 1,400 different Android device manufacturing brands, at least. And so, and I really don't want to discredit them, but for most people, at least the average consumer, most people are looking at the race as either Samsung or Apple, as much as I would hate to say it. And maybe they might consider something like Google or what have you, but that's really what it is in most people's eyes. And so
they have the most funding behind them. I mean, they're going to have the most marketing, and that's, at the end of the day, I think that's what's going to win them. One of the two you're going to win. I mean, obviously, you're still going to have markets for lower cost third-party phones. That's weird because technically everything that runs Android is third-party, but besides the Google phones. But it's an interesting little. It's interesting to see that, because I wouldn't have expected that, of all things, happening. But having that diversity in the market is really nice stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And and even speaking of all of these different brands, a part of this that I think is interesting to fathom really is that in terms of LG leaving, it's not like, for example, other major players such as Nokia, BlackBerry, Motorola, and different instances. Whereas, for them, they were top leaders of the smartphone market at some point or another. And while many people consider them out of the game, they still very much exist. They may have changed ownership, or maybe that company itself no longer is the actual manufacturer, but rather another company. But they're still actually in the race. They're just lesser down, or don't have the same brand recognition as they used to. Whereas LG is just outright leaving. And so it'd be interesting to see, like, if they really stay gone. I mean, I don't really see a true reason for them to re-enter per se, but it just seems so interesting that all of these other legacy brands truly have stuck around at some way or another, whereas LG is personally choosing to exit themselves.
Yeah, it's interesting to see that, because, I mean, it makes sense, right? Because, like you said, there are tons of manufacturers of phones, and if they're not really going to go with their own operating system, there's not really a reason to go, right? There's not a reason to stay in the market, especially if they're losing money on everything.
Yeah, and if I may, one of the things that I think that you actually brought me right into this topic actually is that in terms of companies coming and going, especially throughout the different markets, the one that came to mind is actually BlackBerry. For those who don't know, at the time that BlackBerry was most known, the BlackBerry smartphone brand, it was owned by a company called Research in Motion Limited. They have since changed their name to BlackBerry Limited. And so just to avoid confusion, I will say the whole BlackBerry Limited, just because they have a lot of different brands with their name on it. But BlackBerry Limited, they had been making smartphones for years. And so they always, for the most part, used proprietary operating systems. First BlackBerry OS, then BlackBerry 10, so after the release of BlackBerry OS, and is that BlackBerry Limited, the company, actually purchased the operating system QNX. And while that name may not necessarily ring any bells right now for those listening, and I'm sure it just sounds like a lot of foreign talk right now, but more or less, even though BlackBerry 10 is built off that QNX operating system, but QNX is actually the backbone of a lot of car infotainment systems. And that's BlackBerry's the company's current thing that they're doing is focusing primarily on other ventures such as enterprise and car infotainment systems and other things of that nature. I believe they actually partnered with Ford and Lincoln over the past 4 years or so to primarily be the supplier of those systems for those vehicles. And
sense that I mean, there's two sides of that coin. Being a support role for Amazon and having the Amazon App Store on that would be good. I mean, in theory, it would be good. I know personally, I haven't heard about anything about a Kindle Fire in recent years at all. I mean, we're seeing everything move towards either it's disappearing or it's being bought by Apple, right? Or it's being an Android facilitator.
Yeah, and to finish up my story about BlackBerry, and so what they did was that in 2016, they actually transitioned out of the smartphone market. BlackBerry limited the company, but what they decided to do was the company themselves, as I mentioned, were focusing more on enterprise and other ventures. And so what they did was that they got two companies and a joint venture to essentially take over the BlackBerry mantle in terms of smartphones and other consumer services, while BlackBerry, the company, focused on other stuff. But sadly, what happened in that instance was that I guess there was a little confusion of what exactly was supposed to be going on and a lot of confusion between the few companies. And I'm not sure of all of the exact details, but more or less what ended up happening was last year, TCL was essentially the only remaining active company out of those three, and and BlackBerry did not renew their rights to continue making BlackBerry devices. But now a Texas startup is now going to take the BlackBerry brand sometime this year in terms of smartphones. And when thinking of that, even though that is a very complicated thing, but when I was thinking of LG's transition into their business model, this is really what I was thinking about, because the companies seem to have the same idea in moving into a market that they're better suited to handle, but they have different approaches. Whereas BlackBerry wants to keep their name recognition among consumers and stay in the market in some capacity. LG, on the other hand, is pulling out altogether.
Interesting. Two very drastic different paths they're taking. To harken back to what you said earlier, you discussed how really Samsung and Apple are the only big ones around here, well, at least in America, right? That's not the case for the rest of the world, I think.
Very true.
I would argue. Because you said there's a ton of manufacturers of Android devices, right? The reason, yes. And the only reason that's is because one, it's very cheap to have Android, and then two, it's really, really simple UI, everything, and three, because of both of those, you can have all just different manufacturers, different countries across the world making things all run the same device, the same OS, but they're all drastically different and maybe localized to some extent, which is definitely a boon compared to the Apple devices around here specifically. Focusing on other ventures is definitely a good idea, especially if they're leaving the smartphone market. But I'm curious to see what happens. Hopefully they'll keep something that's commercial, but we'll see.
But it should be interesting to see really how the market moves forward, and if any other companies are going to take similar directions, in terms of what they're going to do in the market.
It was a good strategy to begin with, right? I don't know, what is it, 10 years ago? That's when we really had a ton of smartphones become a big thing, right?
Yeah.
When that happened, everybody jumped in and jumped on the bandwagon to try to get a piece of the pie. And at the end of the day, there were winners, there were losers. Huawei, Apple, Samsung were the big winners. You have some other people that had smaller pieces of the pie, and then you have some that just now, 10 years down the line, are realizing, maybe it wasn't, right now it's not necessarily the best option.
But that is definitely very true. And like just how we said, right now it's the smartphone market. Who knows what it could be in the next 10 years? And so, maybe LG will be the top to that market. Well, I'll just really have to hope for the best for them. And best of luck to LG in their next ventures. I'm certainly going to miss them. But as always, this has been a great discussion with you, Carl. Thank you so much for joining and for keep joining.
Absolutely, thank you. It's been fun, and I'm excited to see what we're going to talk about next time.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you to each of you who tuned into the YouTube version of this. This has been a great experience. And so I definitely think that one day we should try this out again. Of course, the full version will be on my podcast station as always.
Absolutely, yeah. I think it'd be a ton of fun to do some video again. It's a different change of pace.
Yeah, absolutely. But yeah, thank you all so much for watching or listening, or maybe both, to today's podcast. I hope you all really enjoyed it. And I'll catch y'all later. Have a wonderful day, everyone. Stay safe, stay well, and I'll talk to y'all later.